One aspect of life that is sadly unavoidable from the moment you're born is that you are born into a world that is in a state of total war. The reason we can't ever seem to achieve world peace is because just by natural human nature we kind of exist in a permanent state of total war. We're born into wars that are happening and we get embroiled in them whether we like it or not. And we try and solve that particular war in our lifetimes. But while we're doing that, another war brews up in the background that starts to dominate our lives and is the one that the next generation's born into. And in saying this, I don't necessarily just mean situations where human beings walk across fields with guns and trying their best to obliterate each other from the earth. That's sort of like the extreme end point of a war. If you just view wars as people with weapons, you're only really catching the tip of the iceberg. Most of the time, for most of our lives, all the hundreds of different wars that are going on in the background thankfully never escalate to the point where people start hosing each other down in the most violent and aggressive way possible. But thankfully also, for most of these wars that are constantly going on, you don't actually have to be involved, because deep down you're not actually a part of any of the wars. You can choose to be a part of whichever wars you choose to be a part of. And this goes right to the heart of the liberal mindset and is one of the founding bedrocks of a liberal society. As I mentioned in a previous video, for example, at the outbreak of the First World War in the United Kingdom still operated a voluntary army. The entire world was at war, with many countries ordering all of their civilians into total war, and the UK was still operating under a, well, if you want to earn some money and come and fight for us, you're quite welcome to, but you don't have to. I mean, we say you don't have to, but we'll make you feel bad about it, and you might not get such a happy smile from the butcher shop when you go and buy your next lump of meat, and they might give you a bit of a tail end rather than a nice bit and say they haven't got any nice bits left, all that kind of subtle, passive-aggressive peer pressure kind of stuff. But generally speaking, theoretically and philosophically, you had a choice whether you wanted to involve yourself in somebody else's war. And when the war got so bad a couple of years later, about halfway through the war, the Liberal Party, which at the time was the governing party of the day, did decide to finally bring in conscription and go for total national war. But it ended the party because it's an illiberal concept to force people into other people's wars. But the key point is that the bedrock of liberalism as a concept is also a concept of neutrality, or if not neutrality, then choice. You don't want wars, but if a war happens, you're not going to force other people to join in your war. You're just going to fight the war with the resources you have available with the people who are on board with the war voluntarily. And of course, if everybody in the world was liberally minded in a philosophical sense and in a mindset sense, you probably would reduce the amount of global warfare, because most people on the planet would say, why am I getting involved in somebody else's war? More often than not, a lot of people will spend their whole life trying to avoid wars that other people are trying to force them into against their will. And normally, a good way of spotting if there's somebody in power who's probably going a bit nuts and has lost control a bit is normally when they start trying to force other people to join their war for them. A good recent modern example would have been George W. Bush in the United States of America. After 9/11, he got really grumpy, as a lot of Americans did, understandably. But he said to the whole global community, you're either with us or against us. And that's like the ultimate illiberal statement. You cannot put a more definitive illiberal statement to the general populace, because it denies everybody the right to be neutral. It denies everybody the right to say, but that's not my war. And for a lot of people, post 9/11 would have been a lot of people's war. I'm not suggesting that there's an awful lot of people on this planet that probably did consider that to be their war. But it's not everybody's war. And to assume that it is everybody's war is essentially tyrannical. But this is also a positive thing, or it can be a positive thing, because everybody is constantly starting wars. It's part of human nature and human progression to say XYZ is not a good situation, we should do something about it. And very often the only way to do something about it is to engage in the very initial basic elements of warfare, which is to claim something as a problem and then try and motivate other people to realise that something is a problem and that this problem does affect them, and if they don't get involved, their life will get worse. But if they do get involved, the future might be better. The liberal way is always to try and find, obviously, non-lethal methods to do this. And in most cases, there are non-lethal methods to engaging in warfare. And normally, if warfare does emerge and people are dying, that's normally a good sign that this particular war has gone out of hand and extremely illiberal people have taken control of the reins. And as explained in a previous video, illiberal people, when they get control of the reins and go a bit mental for a bit and lots of people die, it might have short-term gains for some people. There might be elements that briefly seem better as a result. But in the long term, it doesn't really improve humanity's lot and generally tends to create more problems in the future than it solves in the present. But when I say that everybody's always at war for something, so what am I talking about? If I'm not talking about people running around killing each other, what do I mean by wars? And what is the point of this video when I'm saying try not to get involved in other people's wars? Wars come about in the most bizarre places and from the most bizarre origins. For example, did you know, some of you probably do, but some of you probably don't, that there's been a war going on for about 20 years between people who like DC Comics films and people who like Marvel comic films. And apparently if you're a fan of one, you're essentially recruiting yourself into an army that is in constant warfare with a fan of another. I suppose similar to being a supporter of a football team, but being a supporter in the way that you like to support the team because it allows you to go and have a punch-up with the opposing team when you go and play against them in the nightlife after the game. And of course that's what sports was. One of the benefits of sport was that it took this human desire for banal, seemingly pointless tribal warfare and isolating it to a condition where, no, if you're not a supporter of either of those teams, you don't have to get involved. People can have their war that they just instinctively enjoy having, and by human nature have a great desire to fight other people about some banal topic. Then sports such as team-based sports like football can provide that. a sort of vent system, as it were. But you don't really expect it of films. When you go and watch movies, you're not really expecting, when you walk into the cinema, you're essentially recruiting yourself into an army. By going online and sharing social media posts about how the Marvel film was really good but that DC film was really shit, you're actually opening yourself up to online assassins who are waiting with bated breath to come and vent their natural urge to be involved in some kind of war, to then effectively stalk you as the enemy, which of course was never the purpose of film. This never used to happen with films, and it's very much a recent development of one of the facets of social media, is that it's allowed all these platforms for these banal warfares to take place. Another war that's been going on for 20 years in a very similar vein is, are you an Xbox or PlayStation? Again, thankfully, if you're not involved, you're not involved. But again, if you do want to make any kind of post about which particular console you own and make any statements as to why you like that console, you're effectively opening yourself up to the open season of the ongoing warfare that you didn't know existed, and you're now a target of one particular group of mercenaries who are fighting somebody else's war for them. And in these cases of Marvel versus DC and PlayStation versus Xbox, almost none of the people involved have any actual benefit from being involved in these wars. They don't know why they're involved in these wars. They just get embroiled in them because they just rumble on in the background, and if you have any kind of fascination for either of these consoles, you will naturally just get drawn into the eternal conflict at some point. But do any of these people who create these pointless online wars, do any of them ever stop and think that, who am I fighting for? What am I fighting for? Is the Xbox Corporation funding me? Is my life going to be improved if the PlayStation no longer exists? Am I just doing this for my own sense of vent relief? And we see a lot of pressure at the moment to have a clampdown on social media, because we're blaming social media for being toxic, and a lot of governments are now planning to ban social media for people under a certain age, and nobody really knows why social media is supposedly bad, because like all things, like all forms of life, people are going to get embroiled in these pointless wars whether they like it or not. Children don't have to be on social media to engage in pointless wars. You know, children will have fights in the playground about any old shit. Surely when they do it online, at least they're not physically harming each other, but I suppose they are psychologically harming each other. But I think one of the things that makes social media so toxic is that it does enable a proliferation of pointless wars, where people so easily forget that they don't really have any real stake in the war they're having. They're just having a war for the sake of having a war. And when new people come along and they haven't developed to a point where they realise they can make choices about whether they really want to get involved in a war or not. They just find themselves embroiled. They unwittingly contribute to the escalation. And again, it's not the fault of social media as a product, because a lot of people do have enough common sense in their brain to see that a war's going on and just think, I really can't muster any motivation to join any kind of conflict about whether one film franchise is significantly better or worse than another film franchise. Both of which are quite evidently just money-making sausage factories that churn through artistic talent and then wrap it in a nice glossy film, and everybody has to queue up and consume it so that stockbrokers can wake up in the morning and see numbers going up. But for some people, of course, this is their reason for existence, and it gives them some kind of purpose. It gives them some way to have the conflict that they feel their life lacks. And I don't think banning social media, personally, I don't think this will resolve the problem. Because prior to social media, people just found other pointless outlets to have their pointless wars. As per usual, as with almost any issue, I suppose, like Americans keep banging on about with the Second Amendment, or whichever amendment it was that allows them to carry assault rifles to the supermarket, you know, with their kids, you know, it's not the gun that kills people, it's the people that kill people. And, you know, sometimes a kid gets hold of the gun and kills people because he's a kid and he hasn't a clue what he's doing. And again, it's the same with social media, isn't it? It's, you know, without social media, people are quite capable of having all these different pointless wars about things. You know, the kids could just as easily find themselves part of a you know, a street corner drugs gang where they're challenging each other for territory the whole time, or supporting, as I say, a football team and finding themselves with a fist in their face at the, you know, Basingstoke's local pub because, you know, the leader of their group wanted a punch up that night because they lost or something, you know. And like with all these things, and getting back to the whole concept of liberalism, is that the only way you really combat any of this kind of human nature is with education. Just making sure that when people do get educated, you get them at the right time. Don't nag them all the way through their life till they're sick of it and they start having wars because they're just sick of you telling them not to have wars. You know, don't over egg the pudding or all that other bullshit that tends to ruin education. But, you know, just when the kids are probably of an age to figure things out, and maybe when they're, you know, just starting to get interest in social media, just, you know, have a lesson about warfare and about how warfare doesn't necessarily just mean guns, and how any intelligent person, before they engage in warfare, should just have a sit down and think about whether they really do actually give a shit about what it is they're supposed to be fighting about. And, you know, where does supporting a multi-billion-dollar sausage factory for no recompense for you personally, is that really a good use of your time and energies and mental fortitude?